Alright, hey everybody, and welcome back to Chapter 9. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about hearing. Now we're going to be talking, now we've talked about what sound is, how sound is measured, what sound, quote-unquote, looks like. Let's talk a little bit about how we are able to detect sound. So now we're moving into basically the anatomy of the ear. This is our good friend. You've seen our good friend before, right? You've probably seen a diagram very similar to this in middle school and high school. So, awesome. But just in case you haven't seen something like this before, we're going to go through it piece by piece and talk about the important parts and how they contribute to how we hear things. Alright, so where do we start? Let's start right here with this part right here, the part that you can grab. That is going to be the outer ear. So, and actually before we get to the outer ear, I'm going to say that the way that we're going to approach this is going to be very similar to Chapter 2, how we approached vision. In other words, we're going to start right here on the outside, we're going to go straight in, and we're going to find our way to the brain. So that's how we are going to navigate through the rest of this chapter. So, the outer ear. The outer ear is going to be the part of the ear that you can grab a hold of, basically. And especially this part that you can grab, that's called the pinna. So, the Pinna. The pinna. If you want to pluralize that, it's the pinnae. So you have multiple pinnae, you have one pinna. So this is going to be useful, not just because ears are cute and adorable, they're not, but so they're not cosmetic, they actually have a purpose, and that purpose is to funnel sound into the rest of your head. So these weird looking ears that we have, the reason why they're shaped the way that they are is because they're basically forward facing. That'll come in handy next chapter, but they're kind of like a funnel. So they start big and they get smaller towards the inside until they get to those canals. And so they're going to take all this sound, is going to collect more or less and funnel its way into your ear so that you can better hear things. So in other words, it already, right here on the outside of our ear, we're already starting to amplify the sounds that are around us, because we're funneling it into this particular ear canal. The way that our ears are shaped, the way that they are formed, is going to accentuate certain sound frequencies. And so the purpose of the pinna is going to be to funnel it into the ear canal. The ear canal, on the other hand, is going to change the way that we hear these sounds. So they're going to essentially amplify these particular sound waves. So the purpose of the ear canal is going to basically amplify these sounds once they get into our head, and then help get it all the way over to the eardrum. The eardrum, if you want to give it by its fancy name, is the tympanic membrane. For those of you that are band geeks out there like me, you think about the timpani, which is that big drum, right? And so that's where we get the name, so the tympanic membrane. And much like a drum, if you are familiar with drums, what are they? Basically, you have kind of like in most cases, you have basically like a hollow body, and then you take a very thin membrane and you put it on top, and then you can hit it. And then when you hit it, it makes a very loud sound, right? Our tympanic membranes work in very much the same way. That's part of the reason why it's called an eardrum. What it is in your ear canal, you're going to have this really thin sheet. This thin sheet, let's see, I'm going to pick out this sheet of paper right here. I don't want to mess it up because I need this sheet of paper, but if you were to stretch this sheet really tightly and then you were to hit it, it makes a very loud sound. Usually the tighter you hold it, the louder the sound is. And so this eardrum is pretty tight and it's very thin, which is going to further amplify that sound. So the sound waves, as they're coming into your ear canal, they're already being amplified. By the time they get to your eardrum, that reverberation, much like if you had a drum head, or if you had a sheet of paper that's pulled tightly, and then you were to shake it, makes a really loud sound, right? So that's kind of how the eardrum works. Now there is a common myth, which is that puncturing your eardrum will leave you deaf. That's not really true. In most cases, the eardrum can heal itself. Not all the time, and it actually is best if you were to rupture it whenever you're young, but a lot of us have ruptured eardrums before, especially when we were kids. For example, whenever I was young, I had an ear infection in both ears, and it ruptured my eardrums. And so they had to put tubes in to help kind of siphon out some of the whatever it is that caused the fluid that caused my eardrums to rupture. And so as a result, I can still hear relatively well compared to the common person. I can't hear nearly as well as the common person, but I can still hear. And so that is a myth. If you puncture your eardrum, it doesn't mean that you will be non-hearing. It just means that in some cases you can lose some of that sensitivity. So, with that being said, it is possible to damage it beyond repair. For example, Stephen Colbert, you know Stephen Colbert from The Late Show, he has one ear in which he is deaf because in some kind of like scuba diving accident, the air pressure was too much and it like completely blew out his eardrum, and so he can't hear in that particular ear. And he's also, he basically can't get it too wet because there's nothing protecting the outside world from his inner ear, or his middle ear, I should say. So the eardrum is protective, but it's also going to be to amplify the sounds, and also if we damage it, it can scar up. And the thicker that membrane becomes through scar tissue, the less sensitive it is. So, for example, again, using this sheet of paper as an example, this is pretty thin, so whenever I shake it, it's pretty loud. But if this were a piece of cardboard, and you shake a piece of cardboard, it doesn't really make a lot of sound, right? So the thicker that it is, the less it amplifies those sounds. All right, so now we're moving, so that's part of the outer ear. Now we're moving to the the middle ear. The middle ear is going to be three bones you've probably heard of before, right? The malleus, the incus, and the stapes, often referred to as the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, I think. We're not going to be using that terminology. We're going to be using the medical terminology, which is the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, or MIS. And it's important to think of them as MIS because that is the flow of information. That is the direction in which sound moves. So as we have that eardrum and it's shaking and it's rattling and it's amplifying that sound is then going to be carried on through vibrations. So you have that sheet of paper vibrating. That sheet of paper is going to be connected to three tiny hollow bones: the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. The malleus is going to shake and it's going to rattle, and that's going to shake and rattle the incus, which is connected to. The incus is going to shake and rattle the stapes, which that's connected to, and the stapes is going to rattle against the oval window. So basically it's a chain reaction that now we are looking at pure vibration. The sound waves, which previously were airborne, usually, moving through air, have now been converted into bone vibration. Does that make sense? That basically, because that eardrum, and I keep holding up this sheet of paper, because this eardrum is rattling, it is connected to, you can think of it as maybe, if you wanted to, three other sheets of paper. And if one of them shakes, the other is going to shake as well. So, so it's going to make its way, so that's kind of how that sound is going to make its way to the inner ear. So here, what we're looking at, this middle ear, is this really small part right here. So let's zoom in on it. And so here you see that we have the eardrum, or the tympanic membrane, that is going to be rattling up against the malleus, which is going to shake against the incus, and is going to shake against the stapes. And then from there, it's going to be pushing against the very base of the cochlea, which is going to be the inner ear. Now, before we get to the inner ear, let's check out these two pieces right here, the tympany muscle and the stapedius muscle. What are those things? Basically, those things are going to be muscles that are going to help us basically tamp down or dampen down some of the sounds that we come across. This is part of the reason why if you go to a really loud concert, it's really loud at first, right? Or a theater is really loud at first, or your car, for example. But if you've been there for a while, you'll notice that it doesn't feel as loud. And you know this because you've been on a highway, for example. Let's say that you're on a highway, you're on the interstate, you're on the Mass Pike, and you're driving, and you got your music turned up, and it feels completely normal, right? Then you pull over to a gas station, you turn off your car, and then you turn it back on while you're not moving, while you haven't been around a lot of loud noises, and it feels excruciatingly loud, right? That's because as we are exposed to these sounds, essentially we start to quote unquote get used to those sounds. And that's because of the tympani muscle and stapedius muscle. They are going to protect us from those loud sounds. As we are exposed to those loud sounds, they are going to kind of slacken up. And because they slacken up, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes are not going to transfer as much energy, as much vibration as they were, which makes it sound to us a little bit less loud. So that's part of the reason why we accommodate to sound as we are exposed to it. So that's one part. The other part of this is that this is also why if you're exposed to a really loud sound all at once, it can be really scary. Just like if you turn your car stereo on when it's really loud, it hurts our ears. Like a gunshot hurts our ears. Like if I were to slam my hand on the table, that hurts our ears because it's not automatic. This sound that we have, this reflex that we have through the stapedius muscle, through the tympani muscle, it's not immediate. It does take a little bit of time to kick in, which is part of the reason why these things actually hurt us, because we're not prepared for those really loud, sudden sounds, because these two muscles haven't helped us accommodate there. So a couple of other things before we get to the inner ear that I want to mention is that as these bones are rattling and as they're shaking and pushing up against the cochlea, they're going to be pushing up against the inner ear, which is going to be filled with a lot of fluid. So we're taking that energy that was the air, we're turning it into vibrations through these bones, and these bones are going to push up against an organ that is mostly filled with fluid. And so now we're going to be thinking about energy and vibration as moving across a fluid membrane. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the inner ear. And I'm gonna probably cut this in half because the inner ear gets kind of complicated. So I'll spend the next 5 or so minutes talking about the inner ear, and then I'll resume in the next video. So the inner ear, so if we were to focus on this weird snail-looking thing, this thing that looks kind of like a squid or an octopus, that is our cochlea. That is our inner ear. So let's give it a look. This is where we are going to transduce sound. So much like how when we were talking about the human eye, we were talking about all these moving pieces and all these parts of our anatomy, all that light was only transduced in the retina, right? So basically, everything we've talked about so far is just a way to get that signal to the retina. Now we're talking about, we've gotten all this to get it to the inner ear, where in the inner ear we're going to experience the cochlea, and the cochlea is going to help us transform that energy into a neural impulse or a neural signal. In other words, into an action potential. Because again, that is the only thing that our brain can understand. The only language that our brain knows is action potentials. And so what we're doing is we are getting our way to turning this physical stimulus, which is movement of air, displacement of air, vibrations, we're turning that into an action potential. This is where this happens. So you can think of this as kind of like being the retina of the ear, the cochlea is. So the cochlea is going to be this kind of spiral structure, and it's going to be filled with lots of different parts, mostly filled with this kind of watery fluid that is going to, if I were to show you right here, basically has 3 different chambers. So we have 2 big ones and 1 smaller one, if we were to bisect this particular organ. And so the oval window right here, and the round window, this is actually where the stapes is going to be pushing up against this against this organ, and depending on how much is pushing up against it, is going to displace a lot of that fluid that is going to be in the cochlea. So if we were to zoom in on it, you can kind of see the different parts of the cochlea. Now, I'm not going to ask you to remember these different canals for this class. What I do want you to think about, though, of this diagram, and again, I'm not going to ask you to label this diagram, but I think the things that are crucially important here are going to be the ideas that these are filled with fluid, but also this particular point right here, which is highlighted in the rectangle. In the middle canal, we have what's called the tectorial membrane. The tectorial membrane is going to be this kind of pinkish purplish thing. That is going to be where we start transducing the sound. So we have all this fluid that's moving and that's shaking depending on the bones that are pushing up against it. And that vibration, that movement, is going to be registered right here at this purplish thing. And you can kind of see where we're going here, where this is going to be hooked up to these different neurons that are going to feed over and outside the cochlea, and they're going to get to the brain, but we'll get to there in just a moment. So let's take a quick look at the cochlea. Again, don't worry too much about these different canals. I'm not going to ask you about these things on the exam because honestly, you'll probably never need this information again until if you were to be maybe a physician assistant, maybe so. But at least in the realm of psychology, you'll never need these things again, so don't worry about them. The only thing that's important is that there are 3 canals separated by these different membranes, and we are going to focus on the organ of Corti. So don't worry too much about these other 2. I want you to focus on the organ of Corti. The organ of Corti is going to be the part of our inner ear that is composed of with hair cells. And hair cells are going to be the photoreceptor of the ear. In other words, if you think about the photoreceptor, moving back to chapter 2, that our retina was made of photoreceptors, right? And these photoreceptors are sensitive to different wavelengths of light. These hair cells are also going to be sensitive to movement. And in the next video, we'll talk a little bit about exactly how they are sensitive to movement. So that's the note that I want to end on for this video. I'm going to pick up in the next video right where we left off right here and talk about how this weird gelatinous thing pushing up against hair cells is registered as movement. I'll see you there. Bye.